Alright, so previously we shot a standard hotel room, and now we're here. We've moved up to a bigger, more complicated space. Rather than being a standard bedroom, this is obviously a bit bigger. This is one of the hotel's fancier suites. This one in particular has amazing panoramic views and goes for about $1,800 a night. So while this is a more complicated space, it's actually going to be a bit simpler to photograph. If you'll remember in the last shot, because the room was so small, we couldn't hide lights anywhere. That meant that we had to light one half of the room, do a bunch of lighting, then light the other half of the room, do some more lighting, and then composite it all in Photoshop. Even though this is a more complicated room from an architectural standpoint, it's a lot easier because we don't have to do that whole shoot one half, shoot the other half. We can just hide the lights in the appropriate spot and get this all in one shot without having to go and do this crazy compositing to put it all together. Because we spent so much time building up that last photo, we went over all the tiny details. In this room, we're going to move a bit faster. I'm not going to show you every little thing I did to stage everything perfectly. I'm going to give the same attention to detail, but I'm not going to walk you through and hold your hand for every little step of the way. Now, obviously, this is a much bigger, more complicated room, and we're not going to be able to get away with just delivering one final image. So we've opted to shoot 3 pictures here. We're going to do a wide establishing shot of what you might see when you walk in the door. We're going to do a shot of the sleeping area, and then we're going to do a shot of the bathroom. There's a really, really cool bathroom, and I think it definitely deserves its own photo. So for the first shot in this suite, we're going to do a wide establishing shot, very similar to the small room that we previously shot. Like the previous photo that we made, the first thing I did when I came in is I walked around and got familiar with the space and took photos in all different locations. As you can see, since we have that amazing view, we've got to shoot this way, and it also helps that everything in the room is basically in front of the camera when we're in this corner. So for obvious reasons, the shot's going to be from somewhere over here. I'm shooting a little bit wider than normal. I've got my 17mm tilt shift, and the reason for that is I want to show everything in the room, and I've got the Canon 5DSR here, which is 50 megapixels. I can always crop in a little bit. As it stands, straight out of the camera, I feel like this frame is a little bit too wide, but I'm going to shoot with a crop in mind. I spent a few minutes kind of getting the camera height exactly where I wanted it, dialing it in, and I've got the final composition set and ready to go. Just like you've seen in the previous lessons, I took my time. I took 10 or 15 minutes to dial in that perfect shot. After the composition was set, as always, I worked on styling the room. So a few quick things. Just like the last room, I took care of the bed. I perked up the pillows. I smoothed out the sheets. I fluffed the pillows on the couch. I made sure that the things on the table were clean and perfect. There's a table in the background. I kind of shifted that so it read a little bit better. I moved the chairs around so that, again, we're not shooting straight into the back of a piece of furniture. I opened up that chair by the desk, and I kind of just spaced out some of the furniture on the deck. We're lucky in that we have this big wall kind of right in front of us here, which means that the staging here was not too complicated. So relatively simple. We only see a little slice of the bathroom. There's not, again, too much staging that has to go on in there. So even though it's a wide shot, there isn't a ton of staging going on. It's pretty standard stuff and nothing out of the ordinary. So now that we have the room staged and looking good, it's time to worry about lighting this thing up. Just like the last room, it's complicated, but it's not as complicated. We're facing some of the same problems, but again, like I said, we don't have to hide lights. We don't have to shoot one half and then shoot the other, so we can get this all in one shot. In order to have complete control of the light in this room, the first thing I'm going to do is shut those sliding wooden doors to black out the light coming in from the exterior. So now we've got those wooden doors shut, and as you can see, there's still a little bit of blue daylight coming through. I'm going to get up my black cloth, and using live view, I'm going to scrim that blue coming in and remove those reflections from the floor. So the first thing that I'm going to do, now that I have control over all the light in the room, is I'm going to set my exposure for the light bulbs in the frame. I don't want any of them to be completely blown out, so I'm going to increase my shutter speed so that all those lights have a nice inviting glow rather than a complete blown out white glow to them. As you can see, it's a little bit dark when we expose for just the bulbs, and we've got to add some fill to bring up the light level of the room. So now that we have the proper exposure for those nice golden glowing tungsten lights, it's time to start adding our own flash. The nice thing about this room, as I said, is that we have some room to actually hide them. Now, it's going to be very similar to the last shot in terms of lighting. I'm just going to be bouncing some light into the ceiling. Similar to the last room, I'm going to be adding a half CTO gel so that we don't have a cool blue flash competing with the warm light of the room. The reason that I'm using the half CTO on my lights instead of the full is that I still want the ambient room lights to be a little bit warmer than the flash. That's going to give a nice inviting glow rather than making everything a uniform white color. So again, I'm going to leave those tungsten lamps a little bit warmer than the light from my flash. So the first strobe I'm going to add is going to be right over here. The reason for putting the light over there is because I want to bounce it off the ceiling and add a little bit of fill to the dining room area and the foreground. So now that I've added my first light, I think that area near the window looks good, but I think it's a little bit too dark in the foreground. So what I'm going to do is add a light about 10 feet to my lift on a lower power, which is going to add some fill light to the foreground. I don't want too much power here because, again, I don't want to flatten out the scene. I just need a little bit of fill. So now we have two lights working on our scene, and our foreground is looking much better. Don't pay attention to the ceiling because even though we do have those hot spots, we're going to take those out in post with ambient lighters that we're going to brush in on top. The third light that we're going to add is going to be near the bed area, and that light is going to bounce into the ceiling, put a little bit of light on the bed, and a little bit of light on the desk. I'm not going to add a light in the bathroom because it's so far away, and I'm just going to use light painting to fill that in later. You may be asking why I add a bunch of flashes before I start light painting. And the reason for that is I want to create a more balanced exposure before I start adding more light. If I were to just start light painting with complete ambient light, there'd be crazy light levels all over the room. The floor would be totally dark over here. By the windows, it would be totally bright. So what I want to do is create a nice, even exposure that I can easily add light onto. That will make it much easier to composite later in Photoshop when everything is balanced versus then when everything has a crazy different level of light on it. So there's one more thing that I want to do before I start adding more light. There's a couple of lights, some practical tungsten lights that are on, and they're adding kind of a harsh, ugly reflection to the floor. I'm just going to turn those off while I light paint so that I get a predominantly flash exposure that isn't affected by those reflections on the floor. I can then add those reflections back in post if I feel that it will look more realistic. Alright, so everything is set. Let's start light painting. Right now, this picture, honestly, it looks pretty ugly, but this is the foundation that I have to build on to create a perfect, polished final image. Alright, so to light paint, I'm going to be using a Profoto B1 and a beauty dish, just like the last shot. Again, an umbrella would be too big, the light would be too soft, and it would just kind of spray light everywhere, and it's not the look I'm going for. Using just hard light is going to be too pinpointed and a little bit too chiseled. I do want a nice, soft, inviting feel. I think a beauty dish is a perfect middle ground between soft, hard, big, and small. So as you can see here, I'm just walking around, adding light, trying to sculpt out these chairs, trying to bring light towards the camera rather than from the camera so I don't flatten things out. Again, I just want to bring out some detail in the textures, in the fabric, the colors, and the shape, things that don't appear normally to the camera without any light added to them. So while I'm doing this, there's a few things I'm looking out for. As you'll notice, down in the bathroom there's a mirror, and that mirror actually reflects all the way back to this wall. So you want to be careful and take your time, make sure that you get everything that you see in the camera. Another thing I look out for, as always, is to not create super flat light. I don't want to be lighting from the same direction as the camera. There's a few exceptions to that, but I can talk about that in post. Once again, I don't think it's worth it to tell you my exact flash settings because every room is going to be different. One thing to keep in mind is that the beauty dish is gelled with a half CTO just to keep it consistent with the lights bounced into the ceiling. So if you want to play with this technique and match it to mine, I just want you to pay attention to the light levels that I'm putting out from this B1. It would be useless to tell you the actual settings, but keep in mind I'm just adding a little bit of light, just enough to bring out some texture. In some cases I'm going for a little bit more power, like on a darker surface. Wood, for example, might take 7 or 8 power, but a white couch might only take 3 or 4. So again, as you're shooting, pay attention, see how I do it. Don't kill everything with light, but don't be so delicate with it that you barely see the light show up. And as you can see, I'm trying to cover every part of this room. For example, the bathroom is very dark. I didn't put a flashback there because I know that the B1 in my hand is going to be more than adequate to cover that small part of the frame. So we're almost done with the interior. The last thing I'm going to do is turn all my flashes off and bracket from really dark to really bright to catch the entire range of brightness with just the ambient interior light. So now that we've finished light painting inside, it's time to get that exterior view. I'm going to go ahead and open these sliding doors, let the light in, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to expose for the exterior. I'm then going to use the B1 that's in my hand with the beauty dish on it. I'm going to light the interior window frames, bring it up to the same level as the interior, but keeping my shutter speed fast enough to keep that view intact. That will then ensure that it's very easy for me in Photoshop to composite in that view. The very last step, like with any picture I do, is I bracket the entire scene with the doors open, the lights on, from very, very dark to very, very bright. This will ensure that, again, we capture the entire range of brightness from the very brightest outside to the very darkest inside. I do this with both the lights on and off, just so I can take care of any color cast problems that arise in Photoshop after the fact. We can use these frames to then tie everything together to give it a nice, natural feel so it doesn't look so super composited or Photoshopped. Now, as you can see, this is more or less the same thing that we did in the last lesson. It's a more complicated space, but a less complicated photo. That being said, let's take these all into Photoshop and see what we can come up with. Okay, so we just finished the first wide-angle shot. This is kind of our establishing shot of the hotel suite here. And unlike the previous room, the very simple room that we shot where we had a very complicated process in post, this is going to be a similar process, but a lot simpler in my opinion because we're not blending two halves of an image together. We're basically just focusing on one picture here, one frame in front of us, and the blending should be a bit simpler. So just like the last photo, in Lightroom here, I'm going to do a quick cull. I'm going to adjust my shadows, get all the raw data that I can out of these files before we go into Photoshop and put this together. This does have a couple of unique challenges that are different from the previous room, and it'll help to reinforce all that you've learned in the last lesson. So here we are in Lightroom. Here's the base exposure. Again, this is the exposure upon which I'm going to build everything, and like I said, unlike the last shot, it's already right here in front of us. We don't have to combine two halves to get this to where we want it. So, as usual, I'm going to bring up my shadows, bring down my highlights, and I think even though you can see our flashes kind of firing into the room, I do think this is a little bit dark, so I'm going to bring the exposure up on this base image just a bit, maybe like a third of a stop or so. And I also think that it's a bit too warm, even though I do want to keep some of that tungsten. I want to balance predominantly for the flash, so we get a little bit of orange, but it's mostly white. So I'm going to just kind of ease off on the white balance here a bit. I'm going to go down to, let's go down to like 3465 or something. I'm just eyeballing this again. I'm just trying to get it in the ballpark of where I know I want the final shot to be, and I'm going to tweak it further in Photoshop. And I'll bring the tint down to, looks a little red still. Something like that. And if I go between the before and the after, you can see it's a bit whiter, a bit brighter. But obviously the color is not yet perfect. I just want something to start with that I can later work in Photoshop and get to the exact perfect spot. So there's our base layer. Now let's take a minute and look through our flash pops here. If I jump back, you can see we're kind of struggling to find the perfect angle for this light. And there's a lot of ground to cover, there's a lot of foreground. So we're just trying to get the best possible shot. And on this one, you can see we're working the couch a little bit. We're working the front of that the table, but I think that's a bit too much. We're working the bottom of the table, and so on. And we go all the way around the room. And I'm just going to select a few of these as I go through for our final image here. And you can see, here's a good example. If I flick between this shot of this table here and this shot here, you can see how much depth and texture and dynamic adding that flash will do, how much it'll make the objects feel much more three-dimensional in the room. So that's a good example of why I add these little flash pops. And moving on, again, we're trying to get this desk over here. So it's just a matter of kind of eyeballing it while you're on location with the Cam Ranger to find the best lighting angle that's going to add that dimensionality to the room. So we'll go through, and for example, like this, I think I missed. This is too high, it's not a really even fall off. I was aiming a bit more on the ceiling than the object itself. Then I kind of back off the flash power, and again, you can really see how that texture in the wall comes out when you add the flash to that area of interest in the frame. So moving on, I flash the floor over here a little bit because in the ambient frame, or in any frame for that matter, where we have this light on, you got these nasty reflections on the floor, and what I want to do is get a nice clean floor, and I know I'm going to have to adjust that exposure in post to get it to match, but you can see the difference between the harsh reflection on that hardwood floor and just having it nice and clean. So we'll combine all of these in our final image to get that perfect polished finished shot. So that being said, I'll just continue going through here so you guys can see how I'm making my selections. Here's the bathroom. Like, this looks a little bit too bright for me, and the next image looks a bit more under control rather than being way overexposed. Again, there's that couch. You can see the difference, how this is very flat, and with the light, you get the couch to almost jump off the frame. So we're going through. Here's our the base exposure again. And then the next thing I did was I bracketed dark to light with those windows still closed. And then we opened them up, and we flashed the window frame here, so we get a nice, clean, perfect view outside, trying to avoid reflections, obviously, on the window. So I'm going to go to one where I'm not in the reflection off to the right-hand side there, going across, kind of skidding the light across the window frame. And I just got a few options of that. Better to shoot more and not need it than shoot too little and just go into Photoshop and say, oh crap, I forgot to get this edge of the window, or I forgot to pop the chair over there, or whatever. So again, no pixels have to die. It doesn't cost anybody any money to take a couple extra shots, make sure to cover your ground. And here's one thing that I was sure to get, and that is the exterior. I didn't want to forget about that. Just like in the last photo, want to make sure we throw some light on those chairs outside, because without any light, it just turns into a black featureless hole. And then again, we bracket with the lights on, and we bracket with the lights off. And these frames may be what I use to do a little color correction as well. You can see there's some mixed lighting in here. We have blue light from the exterior, and orange light from the interior, and like green light from the trees, but with the lights off, the colors are much more consistent and much more white throughout the entire frame. So let's go ahead and filter those, and I'm going to take the adjustments from my base layer here. So here is our base layer. You can see our adjustments over here. I'm going to go ahead and sync these, so Command A to select all, and then Command Shift S to synchronize those settings across all these files. Get everything on the same page exposure-wise, and now we're going to take these and jump into Photoshop and start putting this together. Alright, here we are in Photoshop. I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. I'm going to navigate to this Lessons folder, and I'm going to go ahead and open all those 20 images. Click OK, and Photoshop's going to automatically align those for us. Alright, so here is our file in Photoshop. We're going to start at the bottom, so let's go ahead and turn off all these layers that we're not going to use to begin with. And similar to our last shot, I'm looking at this and obviously there's a few problems here. Like I said, on location, I shot this at 17 millimeters and I was going to crop a little bit. What I want to do is I'm going to just drag out some ruler lines here, just so I can confine my working area to what I know is going to be in the final shot. I don't think we need so much ceiling. Again, I'm just kind of eyeballing this right now. But I'm not going to try to clone that out or anything. I'm not going to deal with this. So when I'm doing the Photoshop process for this photo, I don't want to make any extra work for myself. So anything beyond those ruler lines, I'm not really going to concern myself with, because we made that decision on location to shoot a little wider and then crop the edges rather than shoot a little bit too narrow and be a little bit confined. So this gives us a little extra room to play with. So, all right, let's get started. So we have our base layer here, layer number 20, and layer number 19, which is a layer with all of the flashes off and all of the interior lights on. And I'm just going to blend these two together. I'm going to Alt-click to add a layer mask fill with black. And I'm just going to blend these together so that I can hide those flash hotspots on the ceiling. I can get rid of some of this weird funky color cast. So I'm going to take a big soft brush with my opacity at 30%, and I'm just going to start painting in that ambient layer to cover the tracks here of our flash. But I want to make sure I don't go too far with it, for example, and paint all those awful hotspots in, because again, we did increase our shutter speed to kill those when we were on location. So I'll back up here, and remember I do want to keep that flash lit interior intact. So I'm not going to go too far. This is basically just to make it look like this room wasn't lit with flash, and we can fill in the rest as we move through the file. Alright, so this is looking good. We have covered our tracks from the flash. We've kind of warmed the image up slightly. If you wanted to do any more, of course you can do this to taste, just so it feels like a somewhat natural image. I don't want to go too far with it though. Alright, so now the first step here is going to be to begin adding our flash pops in. And you can see how the quality of light changes so much on that couch. So just as we've done in the last image, I'm going to Alt-click to add a black layer mask, take a soft brush, opacity to your taste. I usually start at 30 or 40%, and just start painting in that flash lit couch over the ambient frame below. And if you turn that on and off, you can see the difference in the quality of light between the two frames. And again, make sure you don't go too far with it and get my shoes or anything. Always want to make sure you give yourself a nice wide amount of area to work with when you're doing this on location. All right, next up is number 17 here for this whole foreground sitting area. And obviously this feels a little bit too hot to me, so I'm going to go gentle on it. So I can go Alt-click to add a black layer mask, take my brush, set my foreground color to white, and again, 30% opacity. Just sort of gently paint in some of that foreground. I don't like the light on this chair, so I'm going to go gentle on it. And we're kind of covering up some of that couch a little bit there. Obviously there's this whole edge right there. Let's make sure we keep a nice smooth transition. I'm going to paint that out. And I'm going to paint out some of this rug. It feels a little hot. But I do want some of that glowiness to it. And on the couch, I think this shadow can go away. So I'll go down a layer and paint that out. All right. Really good. Okay. So next up is layer number 16. That is this chair right here. Again, Alt-click, add a black layer mask, fill with black, take our brush, set our foreground color to white. And let's just paint that in, as we have been doing. Again, don't go too far, you get my feet. We got number 15 over here. We start to get into this dining area. So I'm going to Alt-click, add a black layer mask filled with black, and I'll start painting that in. And the problem that immediately becomes apparent is that we're actually painting in some of this darker frame over what we've already painted. So I'm going to go ahead and change the blend mode of this layer to lighten, and that will allow only the brighter pixels to show through onto the layer below. So we preserve our work underneath by letting those darker pixels just fall away entirely. So I'll keep working on this chair, or this dining area over here, and turn that on and off. Shift-click to see the entire layer. And turn number 14 on. Again, Alt-click, black layer mask, set the blend mode to lighten. Take my brush, start painting it in. Now you realize this is a common mistake that I see. People light things from multiple sides, and what happens is you tend to flatten out the object. When you only light something from one side, you retain the depth and dimensionality of an object. When you light it from all sides at the same intensity, you tend to lose the three-dimensional quality of the object. So I'm going to sort of paint away some of the brightness on layer 15 here. You can see I turn that on and off, like on this chair right here. It looks a little bit, to me, not as three-dimensional. So I'm going to darken the back of it, take my brush, paint away some of that brightness so that these chairs still retain some three-dimensionality. Again, shadow and highlight are what create dimension. And if you remove all that, you're going to get a flat photo. Alright, next up we have the desk. Same thing. Alt-click, black layer mask. Take the brush. Start painting some of that in. If you go too far, make sure you undo it. Or set your blend mode to lighten, whichever you prefer. There's just lots of ways to make sure you keep your previous work intact. Yeah, I like that on normal for that one. Alright, so next we have the TV area here. Again, I'm going to Alt-click, set the blend mode to lighten. Make my brush nice and big. And just start painting in that highlight on the TV, on that whole piece of cabinetry there. Alright. Go up to number 11. That's the headboard, and you can see that texture that comes out when we hit it with light from the side, where it goes from flat to having depth. So let's Alt-click, add our layer mask. For this one, I'm going to make a quick selection sort of around the headboard in bed to keep that light in one place from spilling all over the left-hand side of the frame. And within that selection, I'm going to use my brush to paint it in. Might be a little hot, so I'll back off it a little bit. Something like that. I think my TV needs a little more light. Alright, now let's do the bathroom here. Alt-click, add a black layer mask. Take the brush. And we'll start painting that in. Now you'll notice as I paint this in, we've actually accidentally darkened the reflection on the mirror from before. So if I turn that off and I come out here and I look at, say, my couch frame, you can see if you watch this area, I turn that mask on and off, it lights up. So what we could do, we could leave that on, and we could make a quick selection, I'll use the pen tool, around this window frame. I hit Command Enter to activate it. We'll feather it by 1 pixel. And I'm going to paint that black on this layer so that it reveals what's underneath. And then with that selection still active, I'll come down to my couch layer and I'll paint in some of that brightness down there. Make it feel natural. There we go. Something like that should do. Okay. So we'll go back up, and I think, yeah, that should be that's almost all of our flash pops. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up this file here. Let's go from layer 10 to layer 18, select all those, hit Command or Control G to make a new group. You can double click to rename it. I'm going to call it flash pops, and I'm going to group my base layers together, call that base, and we'll keep those out of the way for the time being. So far we're looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and take care of our windows. Obviously, we cannot deliver a file with these giant flags on the window, so we'll start with number 9 here. And just to get an idea, you can see the window frame. So in order to drop those in again, I've got a pen tool around the entire window frame, so I make a selection of the whole thing. So all of this wood, way down here, between these chairs and everything, so every little area of that window frame has to be pen tooled out. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, I'm going right along this upper edge. Mirror. Don't forget to get this mirror over here. It's pretty tricky down here in these glass lights, so I just go around the edge of the stand. And if it looks like it needs to be fixed, we'll deal with it later, but shouldn't be too bad. Alright, now that we have all of our pen path ready and all the little nooks and crannies selected, go ahead and hit Command Enter to activate the path, to activate the selection from the path, and Shift F6 will feather that edge. I like to feather to 1 pixel again, so it's a bit of a more believable transition from edge to edge. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, let's see, layers 7, 8, and 9, group them together, and I'm going to call this Windows, and I'm going to apply this mask to this group. I can then expand that group, and one by one I'll start painting back in using a black layer mask those window frames. So go ahead and Alt-click to add a black layer mask on this Add Layer Mask button. Everything expanded here, go on and turn on layer number 9. And you're going to Alt-click to add a black layer mask, take our brush, and within that group, again, everything in this group has that mask already applied to it. Make a new mask and start painting in those windows. Now obviously I can't leave myself here in the final shot, so I'm going to go to layer 8 and do the same thing in the other direction. Just start painting in those windows. If you go too far, you can always undo it. Let's see if we need number 7 here. Yeah, I could do a little bit of this as well, just to make that blend a bit more natural. Okay, so now we have our windows in, and this is actually starting to look like a nice finished photo here. The last thing to do is get the exterior, so I'm actually going to take layers 4, 5, and 6, and I'm going to drag them into that windows group. And I'm just going to turn on layer 6 here, which is that patio. I'll set the blend mode to lighten. I'm going to Alt-click to add a new layer mask filled with black, take my brush, and at 30% opacity, just start painting in some of that light on that patio furniture. I'm going to do the same thing for layers 5 and 4, just so we get some detail out in that bar and all that stuff outside. And number 4 here, Alt-click, blend mode to lighten, paint in some light. Blend these together so it's nice and believable. Alright. So that's looking really good. There is this little flash reflection up here. We will fix that in a bit. But for now, let's focus back on the big picture. And there's still a few problems that I want to address, namely these reflections on the floor. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on layer number 3, and I'm going to Alt-click to add a layer mask filled with black, and just start painting away some of those reflections on the floor. And this might go a little bit too dark, so I'm going to make a new adjustment layer. I'm going to make a curves adjustment layer here. I'm going to clip that curves layer, so Alt-click to add a clipping mask, and you can take your little hand tool and click between the two layers here while holding Alt, and you get that clipping mask symbol. And what that's going to do is only going to allow what's on this layer to affect the layer directly below it. And I'm just going to bump some of this up a little bit so that the exposure matches a bit better. And you can paint it out until you get it just right. That's looking good, but it's really this side that I'm concerned about. So let's refine this mask a little bit. And brighten this up until it matches. There we go. So something like that's going to be a little bit better to get rid of those big, huge reflections on the floor. That's looking good. I might fix this little splotchy area in a minute. We'll see when we get there. Okay, so again, checking out all of this frame and seeing what little things I need to adjust. Now, obviously the white balance is pretty good in here, but on the ceiling it's still a bit muddy, a bit too yellowy. So I think it's time that we go ahead and adjust the white balance of the ceiling. So I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. I'm going to go to Hue and Saturation. And what I'm going to do is grab this little hand tool, sample the ceiling, and pull it down so that it's white. But the immediate problem is that we desaturate the entire room. So what we've got to do is make a selection of the entire ceiling here, and most of the white walls as well. So we get a nice even blend. I'll come down a little ways with it, and I'm just going to go nuts here, selecting all of this white upper ceiling area, being careful to avoid the wood, because I don't want to desaturate the wood. I like it nice and warm. But we're going to go all the way around. All right, once we have our ceiling selected, you can hit Command-Enter and Shift-F6 to feather that. And we can delete the original layer mask, and I'm going to apply our new mask to that hue and saturation layer. And we'll do the same trick. I'm going to grab my hand tool, and I'm just going to desaturate this ceiling so that it feels not totally white, but almost like a warm white. If I go too far with it, that to me looks totally fake. So I like to leave it slightly warm. Again, you can do this to your taste. Slightly warm. And now on this mask, if I zoom in here, you can actually see, like right here, where that mask begins and ends. So I'm just going to go around, and I'm just going to soften that transition with the soft brush so that it blends seamlessly into the warmer floor below it. Again, like I said, I do like a little bit of warmth in my photos. I don't desaturate them all the way, but it really is a matter of taste. Okay, so that's looking really nice. What else can we do here? I think this TV could be cleaned up greatly, so I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to name it TV. I'm going to take my lasso, and I'm going to select the inner edge of the screen here around the bezel. And I'm going to create a gradient. So I'm going to select the gradient tool here. You can hit G or find the thing that looks like this. And I'm going to set my foreground colors to black and white. And I'm just going to drag mostly black across that screen. Something like that. And on this layer, I'm going to put the opacity at like 80 or 90%. So there's a little bit of a reflection in there. But it's not totally gone. So there's some semblance of realism still. What I'm actually going to do, it looks like a light stand in there, so before I do that, underneath I'm going to get rid of this light stand with a little clone stamp tool. Doesn't need to be perfect, because we're going to obscure it with that gradient layer. Something like that. And now I turn on that gradient again, and poof, there we go. So I'll group those together, name it TV Fix. All right, next up, there are some cables and cords and such kind of scattered around that I want to get rid of. For example, these down here, those have to go. So let's create a, we'll go with a new group here, and I'll call it Cables and Outlets. Put a new layer in there. And what I'm going to do before that layer even is I'm just going to create a selection around here. Grab my clone stamp brush, clone out some of this outlet area. Now I'm going to copy that, Control-Shift-C, Control-V to paste that to a new layer. I'm going to move this up to cover everything and stretch it out a bit. Then I'm going to add a mask to this. Take a brush, make a nice small brush here. And rather than tear my hair out with cloning, I'm just going to fake it. Because it's such a small part of the frame, we don't have to go nuts on it. I'll do the same thing over here, make a selection with my lasso around these cables. Clone those out. There's some weirdness down here too. All right, that's looking really nice. Let's go ahead and see how we can fix this flash reflection out here. If I turn on my ambient layer, that's not really going to help me. If I turn on this layer, that might work. Let's see, that's a little bit too bright. But I see what's going on out there. So the first thing I want to do here, I feel like this window, I'm looking at this, it's just a little too dark. I'm going to come back down to my Windows layer. In this group, I'm going to add a curves layer, and I'm just going to brighten up everything that's out there. I don't want to get the wood so much, so we can paint that curves layer sort of out of the wood a little bit. Again, don't worry about going outside because We are within the mask of this group, but I do think brightening that up makes it feel a little bit more realistic. And now, I need to get rid of this. So, I'm going to make, in this Windows layer here, a new layer. I'm going to call it Remove Flash Highlight. Grab my pen tool, and I'm just going to pen out this whole area. I'm going to create a selection, Command Enter. I'm going to feather it by 1 pixel, Shift F6. And I'm going to grab, with my gradient tool again, I'm going to sample some of this here, and I'm going to switch my foreground and background colors and sample some of that lighter color down there. And I'm just going to basically replicate this color in this area. So it looks like something like that. And I'm going to go to Filter, Add Noise. We'll go to like 2% on the noise, just so it feels like a natural part of the photo. Without the noise, it's just this perfectly featureless area. With noise, it feels like it belongs there. There we go. Now we zoom out, and that looks nicely fixed. The whole thing looks pretty good to me at this point, but what I'm noticing is that where this ceiling meets the wall over here, it looks a little funky. There's not any direction to the lighting, so what we're going to do is we're going to use some of these ambient frames. I'm not quite sure which one I want yet. I'm going to go with, we'll bring them both with us. But you see how you get this nice fall off up here of light? It looks like it's coming from the window rather than just this flat, featureless interior ceiling. We're going to blend some of that back in to get a more natural feeling scene. So let's grab our 2 ceiling layers, and I'm going to come down, let's see. This was our hue and saturation for the ceiling, right? So let's rename this Ceiling Hue Sat and bring our 2 layers down underneath that. And I'm going to group all these together, and I'm going to call this Ceiling. I'm going to expand this group, and I'm going to turn on, let's start with layer number 1 here. I'm going to grab this hue and saturation mask here. If I zoom in and Command or Control click on it, that mask is reactivated. And I'm going to apply it to this layer here. Now, obviously this looks a little bit fake, too dark, but if I change the blend mode to luminosity, it looks much better, but it still looks a little bit wonky. So what I'm going to do is brush it out until it feels a bit better. Like over here, I don't think it needs to be so dark. Up here, we can make it a bit more natural by the fan. All right, and you turn that on and off, and what you get is a much more natural feeling to the ceiling. It actually has some direction in the light. It feels like it would look in real life. So again, flat ceiling, moody ceiling, flat, moody, flat, moody. Looks much more believable to me. Okay, if you want to use the brighter one, you can do the same trick, but frankly, I feel like, let's try that one. Kind of liking that too. Again, I'm setting the blend mode here to luminosity, which removes all the color information and only blends in the brightness. So we're not undoing any of our color correction or anything like that. And if we turn that ceiling on and off, as you can see, things feel a bit better. All right. All right, so things are feeling really good. I want to fix this ugliness down here. and I want to add some glow to these lights, and I think that'll be it for this shot. So let's see how we can do that. Where am I going to find the glow for these lights? Well, I could go back and make an ambient exposure for them, or I could do my gradient trick. I think I'm going to do my gradient trick, so I'm going to call this one desk lamp. I'm going to come in here with the pen tool. I'm going to make a quick selection all around this light. Make sure I get it in the mirror as well. Command Enter, Shift F6 to feather it. I'm going to take my gradient tool, and I'm going to select like a warmish orange, something like that. And I'm also going to select a white, and I'm going to drag my gradient across those lights. Let's find something nice and realistic here. Something like that. And I'm going to mess with the blend mode, because obviously that looks ridiculous and fake. If I go to color, that looks alright. If I blend the opacity a little bit, or if I leave it at normal, let's see. That adds a nice sort of warm glow to everything. And it sort of matches with this one much better. But it is closer to the window, so I'm okay with it being a little bit brighter, just to get some color in there. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Make a selection all around this lamp. Command Enter, Shift F6, take my gradient tool, and just light it up. Now this one feels, this one also it feels a little like dark or dirty. I don't know what it is. So I'm just going to do it for this one too while we're in here. Command Enter, Shift F6, feather, grab my gradient, and just kind of brighten it up a little bit. Now I have some nice glowy lamps, and things are looking pretty good overall. So the last thing I want to fix is this kind of mess of a light bleed over here or whatever. We did a marginal job at best on that flag, it appears. So I'm going to pen tool around all of this, around the mirror and the shadows. Come up a bit. And some of you guys, if you see my previous work, you know I like to use my gradient trick whenever I can. I'm going to do the same exact thing here. Make a selection, Shift F6, feather it. Make a new layer. I'm going to call this Light Bleed Fix. I'm going to grab, let's see, some of this color and some of this color, and I'm just going to drag it out over all of that. I'm going to go to Filter, add Noise, add a mask, take my brush, and just with the big soft brush, as usual, brush it in so there's a seamless transition. And that is how we're going to fix that. And if I get in here, you can see it looks, for the most part, absolutely perfect. If you wanted to go all the way, you could take out this little seam. But for the most part, that's looking very, very good. if I zoom into 100%, you can see it's almost a flawless replacement. The noise matches, the color matches, and rather than having to go in there and clone it and spend 3 hours going crazy, we could just very simply brush it in. Now, I think this is looking awesome. If anything, I could add a little bit of warmth to this light here. So I'll just go back to my lamp layer, do the same little trick on this guy in the bathroom. Again, select a warm orange and a white, and just sort of drag a gradient, whoop, into there, something like that. Yeah. And I'm going to drag my gradient in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the opacity down to like 30% on the gradient. So when I drag it in, I don't lose any of that texture. I just sort of warm it up a little bit. And all I want to do now is I want to fill in these lights in the ceiling. So let's see. Well, I think what happened was, yeah, when I did my ceiling fix, I kind of painted over the lights. So on this layer here, I'm going to add a mask. And I'm just going to paint back in using a black brush those lights in the ceiling. And I can come down here. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and crop here. I'm going to bring it into, I don't think we need a ratio here. Let's try, let's bring it into our rulers, bring it down a bit. We'll try 4x5 and see how that looks. Yeah, so that looks good. I'm going to crop that. And I guess the last thing to do here is just get rid of this fire alarm. Clone that right out. Alright, so we got rid of our fire alarm, and I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do to finish this off is go Command-Alt-Shift-E and flatten all to a new layer. I'm going to drag out some more ruler lines to the vertical lines in the frame here. And I'm going to go Command-T, Skew, and make sure all of our vertical lines are nice and straight. Again, that's kind of a requirement for all architectural photography. And once that's in place, go ahead and hit Enter and confirm our changes. And if you go to save this and Photoshop throws up an error that's like, this file cannot be saved because it's bigger than X gigabytes or whatever, when you save it as large document format. So it's going to be suite1.psb, and that will allow you to save up much, much larger than Photoshop's arbitrary file size limit. So if you do get that error that says this file is too big, that's how you take care of that. So we'll go ahead and save this, and I might throw some final tweaks on it in Lightroom, but this is our final shot. Relatively complicated, but at the same time a little bit simpler than our last photo of the simple, basic hotel room. All right, so there's our wide establishing shot. We're going to go back on location and get through a couple more shots in this room before we move on to the next location in the hotel.